The rope bit into her wrists, a dull, familiar ache that had become a part of her skin. Dust, the color of rust and regret, settled on her threadbare dress, clinging to the damp patches of sweat under her arms and at the small of her back. She was tied to the saloon's hitching post, an object among others, a forgotten saddle, a splintered water trough. The sun hammered down on the planked sidewalk, bleaching the world to bone-white and shadow. Men drifted in and out of the saloon's swinging doors, their laughter a harsh, splintering sound that broke against the thick, hot air. Some stared. Most did not. She had learned the difference was meaningless. A stare was a cage, and not staring was a cage of a different kind, one made of indifference. She kept her eyes fixed on a loose nail in the porch floorboards, a dark, singular point in a world that had become a blur of shame. She was a debt settled, a hand of cards gone wrong for one man and gone right for another. That was all she knew. Her value had been measured in the flip of a queen and the grit of a man's teeth as he tossed his chips into the pot. The man who had owned her before, a sour-faced drifter named Jeb, had lost. The winner, a man called Corbin with hands too soft and a smile that never reached his eyes, had taken his winnings out here, looping the rope around the post as if she were a new mare he was showing off. He had gone back inside to celebrate, leaving her to bake in the relentless glare of the afternoon. The town of Redemption was a place that had forgotten its own name. It was a clod of wood and dust on a vast, unforgiving prairie, a place where people came to lose their pasts and found only new ways to be haunted. The wind that scoured the single street was a constant whisper, carrying the scent of dry earth, horse manure, and something else, the faint metallic tang of despair. The faces that passed were etched with the same harsh lines as the landscape. They saw her, a girl barely 16, barefoot and bound, and their gazes slid away. She was not their concern. She was a piece of the scenery, a testament to the brutal arithmetic of survival that governed their lives. Her thirst was a living thing, a rasping creature in her throat. Her tongue felt thick and clumsy in her mouth. She tried to swallow, but there was nothing to swallow. A dog, ribs stark against its hide, padded over and sniffed at her bare feet before lifting its leg against the post. A few men on the saloon porch laughed, a sound like stones rattling in a dry gourd. She did not flinch. She had been trained out of flinching. She was a statue carved from exhaustion, her stillness a final, defiant claim on the small space her body occupied. Then, through the haze of heat and the drone of flies, she saw him. He was not on the porch with the others. He stood across the dusty street, half hidden in the long shadow of the livery stable. He was a tall man, lean and weathered, thin as a fence rail. He wore a dun-colored duster that looked as tired as he did, and a hat pulled low, obscuring his face. But she could feel his eyes on her. It was a different kind of looking. Not the greedy appraisal of Corbin, nor the dismissive glance of the townsfolk. It was a quiet, steady gaze, an observation. He just stood there, unmoving, for what felt like an hour, a stone pillar against the shifting dust. He carried a stillness that matched her own, a silence that seemed to pull at the noisy air around them. Inside the saloon, a chair scraped back violently. The swinging doors burst open and Corbin emerged, followed by a few of his cronies. He was flushed with whiskey and victory. He swaggered toward her, untying the rope with a proprietary jerk. "Time to go, prize," he said, his voice slick with ownership. He gave the rope a sharp tug, and she stumbled forward, her numb feet protesting. Corbin paused, looking over the town with a sneer. "Ain't much of a place," he announced to no one in particular. "But at least the cards are honest," he laughed, a short, ugly bark. He was about to lead her away when a voice, low and rough as unplanned wood, cut through the air. "That's my marker she's tied with." Corbin froze. He turned slowly. The man from the shadows had moved. He was standing in the middle of the street now, the sun at his back making him a dark, imposing silhouette. He had not raised his voice, but it carried a weight that made the other sounds of the town, the saloon piano, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, fall away into a sudden, waiting quiet. "What's that?" Corbin asked, his bravado wavering, turning brittle. "The marker. From Jeb?" the tall man said, taking a slow step forward. "He owed me. For seed. From 2 seasons back. You didn't win her. You won his debt. And his debt is to me." The man's face was visible now. It was a landscape of its own, carved by sun and wind and something deeper, something that looked like a long, hard winter of the soul. His eyes were the color of a stormy sky, and they held no fear, only a kind of profound weariness, as if he had seen every possible permutation of human ugliness and was no longer surprised by any of it. He carried whole winters in his eyes. Corbin scoffed, trying to reclaim his footing. "This ain't got nothing to do with you, Silas. This was a poker game. I won her fair." "There's nothing fair about it," Silas said, his voice still low, still steady. He took another step. The dust lifted around his worn boots like ghosts rising. "But the rules are what they are. Jeb's debt comes first. You can take it up with him if you can find him. Until then, she's the settlement." He held out a hand, not to Corbin, but palm up, an offering to the space between them. "I'll take her." The words hung in the air, simple and absolute. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact, as unadorned and solid as a rock. The men on the porch were silent, watching. This was a different kind of spectacle. Corbin's eyes darted around, looking for support, but he found only watchful neutrality. Silas was not a man to be trifled with. He lived alone, worked his hardscrabble ranch without complaint, and kept to himself. But there was a line, and everyone in Redemption knew it. Silas was a man of his word, and he expected the same from others. His honor was a quiet, unyielding thing. Corbin's face twisted into a mask of pure spite. He looked from Silas's unmoving form to the girl, his prize. For a moment it seemed he would fight, that his pride would not allow him to back down. He tightened his grip on the rope, making her wince. Silas's hand, still outstretched, closed slowly into a fist. He did not move, but a tension coiled in the air around him, sharp and dangerous. Finally, with a curse that was little more than a hiss of air, Corbin threw the end of the rope onto the ground. "Take the scrawny thing," he spat. "More trouble than she's worth." He turned on his heel and stomped back into the saloon, his cronies shuffling awkwardly behind him. The dust settled. The street was empty except for the two of them. Silas walked forward, his steps measured and slow, as if approaching a spooked animal. He stopped a few feet from her and knelt, the joints in his knees cracking softly. He didn't look at her face. He looked at the ropes on her wrists. He pulled a small, worn pocket knife from his duster. The blade clicked open, a clean, sharp sound in the silence. He reached out, his movements careful and deliberate. His calloused fingers brushed against her skin for just a moment as he slipped the blade under the coarse fibers. The rope parted with a soft rasp. He did the same for the other wrist, his breathing the only sound between them. Her hands were free. They fell to her sides, heavy and useless. Red welts circled her wrists, angry and raw. She flexed her fingers, trying to coax life back into them. She still did not look up. She kept her eyes on his hands. They were large, cracked, and scarred from work, but they had been gentle. He stood, folding the knife and tucking it away. He picked up the discarded rope and coiled it with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. He did not offer her a hand. He did not touch her again. He simply turned and started walking, his long strides eating up the dusty ground. After a few paces, he stopped and looked back, not at her, but just over her shoulder. His voice was quiet. "Come on." And she did. She had no choice, but for the first time in a long time, it felt less like a command and more like an invitation. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs trembling, and followed the dark shape of the man moving away from the town, away from the staring eyes and the baked-in shame of the saloon porch. The journey was a silent one. He walked ahead, setting a slow, steady pace that she could match. The sun began its long descent, painting the western sky in bruised shades of purple and blood orange. The land stretched out around them, vast and empty. The wind a constant, mournful sigh across the prairie grass. It was a hard country, a land that promised nothing and delivered on that promise with brutal consistency. Once, he stopped and unhooked a canteen from his belt. He drank, then held it out to her without a word. She took it, her hands shaking slightly. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was the most beautiful thing she had ever tasted. She drank until her throat no longer felt like sandpaper, then handed it back. Their fingers did not touch. He nodded, a barely perceptible dip of his head, and they walked on. The silence between them was not empty. It was a wide, open space, a canvas on which the sounds of the world, the cry of a distant hawk, the rustle of their own feet in the dry grass, were painted with stark clarity. They arrived at his home as dusk was thickening into night. The house was a small, grim silhouette against the fading light, a squat cabin made of weathered timber that had gone gray with age. It stood alone, miles from any other sign of life, a solitary tooth in the jaw of the wilderness. A single stone chimney rose from the roof, cold and dark. Beside the house, a small fenced plot held the shape of a grave, marked by a simple wooden cross. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. He pushed the door open, complained with a low groan. The air inside was cool and still, smelling of wood smoke, dust, and something else. A faint, lingering scent of lavender and loss. It was the smell of a place that had been empty of a woman's touch for a long time. The cabin was a single room, spare and functional. A stone hearth dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center. A bed, neatly made, was tucked into a corner. Everything was clean but worn, scrubbed but unadorned. He moved to the hearth, striking a match. The flame flared, casting dancing shadows that made the small room seem vast and cavernous. He built a fire with the same unhurried competence he did everything else. Soon, a small, cheerful blaze pushed back the gloom and the chill that had begun to creep into the air. He gestured toward the table. "Sit." She sat, pulling her bare feet under the hem of her ragged dress. He moved around the small space, taking a pot from a hook, filling it with water from a bucket. He cut thick slices from a slab of bacon and a loaf of hard, dark bread. He did not speak. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the quiet, domestic noises of a meal being prepared. He placed a plate in front of her. Bacon, sizzling and fragrant, and 2 thick slices of bread. It was more food than she had seen at one time in months. He sat opposite her with his own plate and began to eat. She watched him for a moment. Then, her hunger a sharp, painful knot in her stomach, she ate too. She ate slowly, carefully, as if she feared the food might be snatched away. When they were finished, he took her plate. He pointed to a small, curtained-off alcove she hadn't noticed before. "You can sleep there," he said. "The door doesn't have a lock. I don't lock doors." The words were a promise. Contract. She looked at him, really looked at his face for the first time in the flickering firelight. The lines around his eyes and mouth were not just from age or sun. They were lines of grief. He had carried his own burdens for a long time. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was the first time she had responded to him in any way. She went to the alcove. Behind the threadbare curtain was a narrow cot with a thin mattress and a single, clean-smelling wool blanket. It was a space of her own. She lay down, not bothering to take off her dress, and pulled the blanket up to her chin. The firelight cast a warm, orange glow on the rough fabric of the curtain. She could hear the sound of him moving about the cabin, the soft thud of his boots on the floorboards, the scrape of a chair as he sat by the fire. For the first time in more years than she could count, she was not bound. She was not in a cage. And she was not afraid. The house was quiet. The man was quiet. And in that quiet, she fell into a deep and dreamless sleep. The days settled into a rhythm, as slow and steady as the turning of the earth. Life was measured not in hours, but in tasks. Chopping wood, hauling water, mending fences that sagged like tired old men. Silas worked from sunup to sundown, a relentless, silent battle against a land that was always trying to reclaim what was his. She watched him at first, a shadow in the doorway of the cabin, unsure of her place. He never told her what to do. He never gave her orders. So she began to find her own work. She started with the cabin. She swept the floorboards until they were clean of the fine, pervasive dust that coated everything. She scrubbed the tabletop with sand and water until the wood grain showed through, pale and clean. She washed their plates and the single pot in a basin, her hands turning red in the cold water. These small acts were an anchor, a way to claim a piece of this new life, to make it hers. One afternoon, while he was out checking his boundary lines, she walked to the small, fenced-in grave beside the cabin. The wooden cross was weathered, the name carved into it almost erased by the wind and rain. Anna. She knelt and began to pull the stubborn weeds that grew thick around the base, her fingers digging into the cool, dark earth. She did it without thinking, a quiet act of tending. When she was done, she found a single stubborn prairie wildflower, a splash of defiant yellow, and laid it on the packed dirt. She did not know who Anna was, but she knew what it felt like to be forgotten. When Silas returned, he saw the cleared patch of ground and the solitary flower. He stopped, his shoulders slumping just a fraction. He stood there for a long time, his back to her, looking at the grave. He never mentioned it. But that evening, when he came in for supper, he left a small pile of freshly picked wildflowers on the table. He said nothing, just set them down as he passed. She found an old bottle and filled it with water, placing the flowers in the center of the table. Their colors were a small rebellion against the drabness of the cabin. They worked in parallel, a silent dance of shared existence. She learned the language of his movements. A certain set to his jaw meant a fence was down. The way he rubbed the back of his neck meant the well was running low. He, in turn, learned hers. He saw the way she saved the last of the bread for him, the way she mended a tear in his shirt with tiny, neat stitches, her head bent in concentration. One day he was splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of the axe a heartbeat for the ranch. The axe head, worn and loose, flew off the handle and caught him on the shin. He swore, a low, sharp sound, and sank to the ground, his face pale. She ran from the cabin, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. "You hurt?" she asked, the words feeling clumsy and loud in the quiet air. It was the first question she had ever asked him. He just gritted his teeth and nodded, blood seeping through his trousers. She helped him limp inside, his weight heavy against her small frame. She tore a strip from one of the clean rags she kept by the hearth and, with trembling hands, cleaned the wound. It was a deep, ugly gash. He sat stoically, his hands clenched on his knees, watching her. Her touch was gentle, surprisingly deft. When she had bound it tightly, she looked up at him, her eyes wide with concern. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. She just nodded, pulling back as if she had touched fire. But something had shifted between them, a barrier crumbling into dust. That night, they ate in a silence that felt less like an absence and more like a shared space. He had defended her in the town. She had tended his wound. They were stitching their lives together with raw thread, one quiet act at a time. He began leaving things for her. A pair of sturdy boots, worn but serviceable, appeared by her cot one morning. A thick wool shawl was draped over the back of her chair when the evenings grew colder. He never presented them as gifts. They just appeared, silent offerings. In return, she began to cook more, experimenting with the meager supplies. She learned to make a stew from tough cuts of meat and wild roots. She even tried to bake bread. The first loaf was a disaster, a dense, hard brick that could have stunned a coyote. He picked it up, tested its weight in his hand, and a small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. "That loaf died in vain," he said, his voice dry. She felt a flush of heat in her cheeks, a mixture of embarrassment and something else, something she couldn't name. It was a little dry. "You didn't complain about mine," he countered, and the smile widened just a fraction. It transformed his face, easing the harsh lines of grief for a fleeting moment. It was the first time she had heard anything resembling humor from him. It was a small, fragile thing, but it felt like a turning point, like the first crack of a thaw after a long winter. The real thaw came on a night when the wind turned mean, howling around the corners of the cabin like a hungry wolf. It rattled the door and whistled through the chinks in the timber, a sound that scraped at her nerves. She lay on her cot, listening, the sound pulling her back to other nights, other locked rooms, other fears. A nightmare seized her, a suffocating blanket of old terror. She was back in a dark, cramped space, the smell of stale whiskey and unwashed bodies filling her lungs. A hand was on her, rough and cruel, and a voice was whispering ugly things in her ear. She cried out, a thin, strangled sound, and thrashed against the blanket, fighting phantoms. The curtain to her alcove was pulled back. Silas stood there, a silhouette against the fire's dying glow. He held a lantern, the light soft. He didn't come closer. He just stood there, his presence a solid, reassuring anchor in the storm of her fear. "You're all right," he said, his voice low and steady. It was not a question. She was breathing hard, her body trembling. Tears streamed down her face. "Don't lock me in," she whispered, the words torn from a place deep inside her, a place she kept hidden from the world. "Please, don't ever lock me in." He was silent for a long moment. Then he knelt, placing the lantern on the floor. The soft light illuminated his face, and she saw not pity, but a profound and weary understanding. He looked at her, his stormy eyes holding hers. "I told you," he said, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear it over the wind. "I don't lock doors. Not ever." He stayed there, kneeling by her cot, until her trembling subsided and her breathing evened out. He didn't say another word. He just stayed, a silent guardian, until she drifted back to sleep, this time into a quiet darkness, free of dreams. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. That night, in the quiet of the storm-tossed cabin, something new began to grow. It did not have a name yet, but it felt like trust. The seasons turned. The harsh, bleached white of summer gave way to the gold and brown of autumn. The routine of their lives was as ingrained as the lines on their hands. One morning, as Silas was repairing a harness on the porch, he saw it. A small plume of dust on the far horizon. It was too deliberate for cattle, too focused for a dust devil. It was riders, and they were heading straight for his ranch. A cold knot formed in his stomach. He had known this day might come. The world did not forget a debt, especially one a man like Corbin felt was owed to him. He watched the dust cloud grow, a creeping stain against the clear blue sky. She came to the doorway, wiping her hands on an apron she had fashioned from a burlap sack. She saw the direction of his gaze and her body went still, her face becoming a pale, blank mask. The past had a long reach. He straightened up, his movements slow and deliberate. He did not look at her. "Go inside," he said, his voice flat. "Stay away from the window." She hesitated for a second, her eyes locked on his back. Then she nodded once and disappeared into the gloom of the cabin. He heard the soft click of the door closing. He stood on the porch waiting, his hands loose at his sides. He was not a man who owned a pistol, but his wood axe leaned against the wall nearby, its blade gleaming dully in the morning sun. 3 riders reined in their horses a dozen yards from the house. The man in the middle was Corbin, his soft hands now covered by expensive leather gloves, his face smug and expectant. The 2 men with him were hired muscle, their faces hard and impassive. "Silas," Corbin called out, his voice carrying an oily confidence. "I've come for what's mine." Silas did not move. He let the silence stretch, the only sound the nervous stamping of the horses and the ever-present whisper of the wind. "You have nothing here that's yours, Corbin," he finally said, his voice calm and even. Corbin laughed, a short, unpleasant sound. "Don't play dumb with me. I've got a bill of sale, signed by Jebediah himself. Says I bought and paid for one girl. Legal and binding, He patted a pocket on his coat. I came to collect my property. The word property hung in the air, ugly and obscene. It landed like a stone in the quiet clearing. Silas's jaw tightened. She's not property, he said, his voice dropping lower, gaining a dangerous edge. She's a person. And she's staying here. Is that so? Corbin swung down from his horse, his boots sinking into the dry dirt of the yard. The land was Silas's. This was a violation. You think you can just take what you want? That's not how the world works. She belongs to me. I won her. You won a coward's debt? Silas countered, taking a single step forward, to the edge of the porch. He was on his land, his ground. You want to talk about what's legal? Let's ride into town and talk to the marshal. Let's see what he says about a man selling a girl to settle a poker loss. Corbin's smirk faltered. He knew as well as Silas that while the town might turn a blind eye, bringing the law into it was a different matter. It was messy, unpredictable. This is between you and me, he snarled. Give her up and I'll ride out. No trouble. No, Silas said. The word was final, unbreakable. Corbin's face darkened with rage. Then we'll take her, he gestured to his men. Get her. The two thugs dismounted, their intentions clear. They started towards the cabin, their steps confident. Silas moved, faster than he had in years, placing himself between them and the porch. He didn't reach for the axe. He just stood there, his body a silent, unyielding wall. You'll have to come through me, he said, his voice a low growl. The men paused, glancing at Corbin. For all his quietness, Silas had a presence, an aura of solid, unshakable resolve that gave them pause. Just then, the cabin door creaked open. She stood in the doorway, her small frame silhouetted against the dark interior. She was no longer a blank, passive girl. Her eyes, fixed on Corbin, burned with a cold, clear fire he had never seen before. Her face was set in lines of defiance, and in her hands, she held Silas's heaviest cast-iron skillet, gripping the handle with both hands like a weapon. She did not tremble. Get off this land, she said. Her voice was not loud. It was thin and it wavered slightly, but it was clear and sharp as a shard of glass. It cut through the tension with shocking force. Everyone froze. Corbin stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. He had expected a cowering, terrified girl. He was not prepared for this. This was not the object he had won. She took a step forward, out onto the porch to stand beside Silas. The skillet did not waver. He said you have to go through him, she said, her voice stronger now, feeding on her own courage. But you'll have to go through me, too. Silas glanced at her, a flicker of something, astonishment, pride, in his weary eyes. He had stood to protect her. But now she was standing to protect him, to protect their home. They stood together, a united front. The stoic, grieving man and the girl who had found her voice. A broken man and a girl who refused to be broken. Corbin's men looked uncertain. This was not the simple collection job they had signed on for. They looked at Corbin, awaiting his command. But Corbin's bravado had evaporated, replaced by a baffled fury. He was being defied by a man with nothing and a girl with a piece of cookware. The humiliation was more than he could bear. This isn't over, he hissed, his face mottled with rage. He backed away, stumbling slightly, and hauled himself back onto his horse. You'll regret this. He wheeled his mount around and galloped away, his men scrambling to follow, leaving a cloud of ignominious dust in their wake. The dust settled. The silence that returned was different now. It was not empty. It was filled with the echo of her voice, with the quiet strength of their stand. Silas turned to her. She was still holding the skillet, her knuckles white. He reached out, not to take it from her, but to gently lay his hand over hers on the handle. His touch was warm and steady. I was scared, she whispered, the admission a crack in her newfound armor. I know, he said softly. So was I. She looked up at him, and for the first time she smiled. It was a small, fragile thing, but it was real. "You didn't run," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. She had not run. She had stood. She had fought. He looked down at their hands, his scarred and weathered, hers small but strong, clasped together around the handle of the skillet. In that moment, something unbreakable was forged between them, something stronger than steel and more resilient than the hard land they stood upon. That evening, the air in the cabin was different. The house, which had long felt like a shell holding the memory of loss, now felt full. It breathed again. They sat at the table, the stew she had made simmering on the hearth, filling the room with a warm, savory scent. The wildflowers she had picked days ago were still in the bottle, a small spot of enduring color. He looked across the table at her, at the girl who had faced down her past with a piece of iron in her hands. She was no longer just a debt settled, a prize one. She was a person, fierce and resilient. She had a history, a story that was now intertwined with his. But he realized, with a sudden, sharp clarity, that he did not know the most basic thing about her. "They never gave you a name, did they?" he asked, his voice gentle. She shook her head, her eyes on her plate. She had been girl, you, prize. Names were for people who mattered. He thought of the grave outside, of the woman who had filled this house with light before sickness had taken it away. He thought of her quiet strength, her gentle spirit. He saw a reflection of that same resilience, that same core of goodness, in the girl sitting across from him. It was not a replacement. It was an echo, a continuation. "Lena," he said, the name soft in the firelit room. "I'll call you Lena, if that's all right with you." She looked up, her eyes wide. Lena, a name, a real name, felt strange and wonderful on her ears. It was a gift, more precious than food or shelter or a warm blanket. It was the gift of identity. She tried the shape of it in her own mind. Lena felt like her, felt like the person she was becoming. She nodded, unable to speak, a lump forming in her throat. A single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. The next day, she gathered the ragged, filthy dress she had arrived in, the one that smelled of fear and dust and public shame. She took it to the fire pit outside, the same one Silas used to burn rubbish. He stood at a distance, watching, understanding this was something she had to do alone. She dropped the dress onto the embers. It smoldered for a moment, then caught, the flames consuming the tattered fabric, turning the memory of her past into smoke and ash that the wind carried away across the prairie. It was a baptism of fire. In the weeks that followed, the house changed. A curtain, stitched from old flour sacks, went up over the window. A rug, woven from scraps of cloth, appeared on the floorboards by the hearth. Small things, but they were signs of life, of a home being built, not just inhabited. Silas found himself smiling more, small, quiet smiles that Lena returned. He started talking more, telling her about the seasons, about the ways of the land, about Anna. He spoke of his grief not as a wound that would not heal, but as a scar that was now a part of him, a memory he could carry without being crushed by it. And she listened, her quiet presence a balm. One evening, they sat on the porch steps, watching the sun set, a ritual they had fallen into. The sky was a riot of color, a masterpiece of fire and gold. The air was cool and clean. A comfortable silence settled between them. "You're either the kindest man I've ever met," Lena said, her voice soft, "or the most foolish." Silas looked out at the horizon, a ghost of his rare smile on his lips. "Can't I be both?" he asked. She leaned her head against the porch post, a sense of peace settling over her, deeper and more profound than any she had ever known. This was home. Not the cabin, not the land, but this quiet space between two broken people who were slowly, carefully, making each other whole. The final image was not of a rescue, but of a beginning. Two solitary figures on a porch, watching the end of a day, a man who had lost his family and a girl who had never had one, finding it in the most unlikely of places, there in the vast, silent heart of the prairie. This story, it ain't just about a rescue. It's about a naming. About the moment someone looks past the grime and the ropes and the story everyone else has written for you and sees a person waiting to be called into existence. It's about the quiet courage it takes to accept that name, to burn the old rags of who you were and stand in the smoke, new and uncertain, but finally free. We all have those moments waiting for us. Moments where we are tied to a post, judged by a crowd, valued by the turn of a card. We wait for a Silas to see us. But the real truth, the hard and beautiful truth, is that sometimes we have to be our own Silas. We have to be the one who walks into the street, who cuts the ropes, who speaks our own name into the silence for the first time. So here's your naming. It's in the quiet work of your own hands, in the tending of your own wounds, in the courage to pick up a skillet and defend the small patch of ground you've claimed as your own. If you're brave, if you're quiet enough to listen past the noise of the world, you might just find that the person you've been waiting for to save you has been there all along. It's the person you see in the mirror. And if you're very lucky, you might just find someone to sit on the porch with and watch the sun go down.